Go.
All right. Well, since it is promptly 11 a.m. Mountain Time, which would be 10 a.m. Pacific, 12 p.m. Central, and 1 p.m. Eastern, we're going to go ahead and start today's webinar. I am so excited to welcome all of you to Growing in Today's Higher Ed Landscape, presented by Dr. Cherron Hoppes. So this is the first webinar of our new Enrollment Growth webinar series. And in this series, we'll really be doing a deep dive into multiple aspects of enrollment growth, from goal setting to marketing, enrollment ops, retention, and through data optimization. This series is based on our new ebook, the Enrollment Growth Playbook. If you haven't gotten your hands on one, I really encourage you to head to our website, which is helixeducation.com, to download your free copy. Before I introduce our presenter, I'm just going to cover a few housekeeping items here. Please feel free to enter any questions you have as we go into the chat box feature in the webinar. Dr. Hoppes will be fielding these questions at the end, but I will be taking note of all the questions as they come and make sure that we'll try to get as many of them answered as possible. Additionally, we are recording this presentation, and all attendees will be receiving both a copy of the slide deck and a link to the recording after the webinar has ended, so you can expect that coming your way after the event. So without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce Helix's Chief Academic Officer, Dr. Cherron Hoppes. Dr. Hoppes is a veteran higher ed professional with extensive expertise in academic administration, including learning outcomes assessment and curriculum design. She's also versed in enrollment management, adult education, and technology to support student services. Prior to joining Helix, Cherron served as Dean of Undergraduate Programs for the, you're going to have to correct me on the way they pronounce the Ageno School of Business, Ageno School of Business at Golden Gate University. So with that, Cherron, I will pass things over to you.
Thank you so much, Danielle, and thanks to all of you who've decided to take part of your busy day to join us for the discussion. As Danielle mentioned, this is just one part of a series of webinars that we're going to be doing. And since this is the first, we wanted to talk at a higher level, kind of get a lay of the land of the context from which we're going to be presenting all of the conversations around enrollment growth strategies for your institutions. And so today's time is really going to be thinking about what's happening in higher education and where things are going, and what do we need to be thinking about as leaders at our campuses to navigate all of this. So in today's discussion, we're going to talk about some of the obvious stuff, the internal and external pressures of change in higher education. Then we'll also talk about some ways that we can think about response to the dynamic world that we're living in and everything that's going on. So this is one of my favorite quotes from a fairly recent writing on the American faculty, and I think those of us who have worked with faculty, we know that there is no better demonstration of where change has happened than in seeing how the faculty role has changed. But there's a lot in here that really indicates just what our institutions are up against. We've been discussing change for higher ed probably since the early 1980s, but I think this century in particular has seen unprecedented change in what's happened for our institution. And there's a number of areas where that change has occurred. Some of that comes from external pressures. And there's a number of things facing particularly those of you who are currently serving a traditional residential population that you can kind of feel is coming down the pipeline. And first and foremost, that's a decline in the available student population for that traditional residential population. This is not because we're graduating as a percentage a fewer number of folks from our high schools, but really it's that there's that many fewer people available who are attending schools K through 12. And that's just a shift in our population demographics. And so as that occurs, the sense really is that 2017, that class is going to be the start of a reduction in the number of high school graduates available to enroll in college, and we're going to live in that environment at least until 2023 before we'll see an uptake in that. And so that means some dynamic pressure on institutions that have long relied on that traditional residential student population to really keep keep the organization going. And so that means we need to think about our business models differently and opportunities differently. Along that is a continued increase in the number of adults that are available to attend institutions and the desire of those adults to come back. This is particularly true in the undergraduate degree completion environment. The most recent information from the United States Census Bureau is that there are more than 36 million adults with some college but no credential. And we know from the information of layoffs and unemployment during our last economic downturn that the population that actually was most negatively impacted was that group, those folks with some college and no credential. They actually fared worse in the employment space than folks with just a high school diploma did. And so there's a real understanding and awareness that there's value in working to the end and getting that undergraduate degree, and that creates an opportunity for institutions that may not have explored fully what it means to serve that population. And you'll see in some of our future webinars that we'll get into more depth, because you can't do business the same way if you're going to really serve this population well as you might in your traditional models. And so those considerations will be really important for institutions as they move forward. The other thing that we're going to see as we move forward in this next decade is ever-growing diversity, and that's across the board. A shift in the ethnicity of the students that attend our institutions, a continued shift in the gender of those populations. We know in the adult space in particular, and in many of our institutions, we are now in environments that are predominantly women. And while that's wonderful, we need to be thinking about how can we engage men in the college experience so they too are reaching student success. And then of course the socioeconomic diversity and what we see there and what it requires for us to be creative both in our own institutional policies, but then how we navigate federal policies to make sure that students with need are actually able to achieve post-secondary success, and it's not out of their reach simply because of a matter of price. So all of these things externally put tremendous pressure on institutions as they think about what their next 10 years are going to look like. The other piece that is particularly challenging right now in today's environment is an uncertain regulatory environment. And would we have done this webinar even 60 days ago, this conversation would be incredibly different than it is today. But a new administration and the announcement less than 30 minutes ago that we now have a new Secretary of Education that's been approved by the Senate means that there are a number of things that folks just have no idea where we're going to go. The Obama administration's agenda around post-secondary education was really becoming clear in the last part of his tenure as president, and I think we all kind of had a sense of the trajectory of where things were going to go around accountability and around what we could expect from that. And I, at this point, without my crystal ball working well, really would say hold on to your hat, because I don't think we have a full understanding of what the potential implications are of the environment that we're currently in. And that makes it really challenging as we think about resource planning and just what it means for the things that we should have on our radar for institutions. And so this is a particularly precarious environment for us to try to figure out and measure these external pressures. And then, of course, we have internal pressures and dynamics that are happening on our campuses that make things particularly challenging. I'm a big organizational culture fan. I believe that it has tremendous weight in our ability to navigate circumstance and to manage change. And I think Peter Drucker sums it up best when he talks about culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I'm sure we've all been in that environment where we think we have the best laid out strategy possible, but not paying attention to the culture and the nuances and the traditions of the environment that we work in, and not respecting those and trying to bring in strategy can really be a strong lesson learned on how to be respectful of those things. And so that's something very important for us as we think about some of these internal pressures. Some of those things include, the one thing that we can probably least control, and that's our own student enrollment behavior. It's probably been 2 decades now that we've talked about student swirl, that idea of students concurrently enrolling or moving in unusual patterns and ways to collect credits to be able to achieve their academic goals, and that's not going to change. As a matter of fact, I think we're going to need to be even more sensitive to ways that students can acquire credit and knowledge, and how we really work with them to reflect what's been learned and how that has value towards a degree. But that is a challenge in particular that I don't think we're going to be able to change, but we can certainly influence and support in a way that's beneficial for our students and beneficial for institutions. The other reality is an increased competition, and I think where we see it the most are for the number of institutions that are choosing not only to serve the adult post-traditional student, but to do it in the online environment. Our Vice President of Marketing Services, Seth Odell, has said on more than one occasion, today is the easiest day you'll have in really planting a flag in this space for online education. Every day that goes by, the competition becomes more fierce. And so what does that mean? That presents challenges for us to figure out how to differentiate ourselves, both in terms of the learning experience, the kinds of programs that we offer, but also the experience the student receives overall in engaging with our institutions, and how do we differentiate ourselves amidst some very similar stories, and what do we need to do to pay attention to that. The other piece that goes hand in hand with all of this is certainly uncertain financial sustainability for many of our institutions, and we see this in particular in the private nonprofit space, stories of institutions that are just facing insurmountable deferred maintenance and cost of operations against declining enrollment, and what that means for them in the long haul. And not only does that space struggle, but also the challenges of our public institutions as they face uncertainty against their legislatures and what will be the competing agenda for a particular year in terms of financing. So both understanding what the possibilities are in a short-term strategy for institutions, but also how do we make decisions today to really support the long-term financial sustainability of our campuses is absolutely critical. We also have competing interests across constituencies, and those are not necessarily bad things. I think that helps keep us on our toes and always striving for continuous improvement, but it also can be divisive. And this is certainly a time where competing ideas in the effort of moving forward and improving, absolutely welcome, but competing ideas that are not constructive and that are roadblocks to the future success of the institution can be incredibly challenging. And how do you balance those competing interests? How do you make sure that voices are heard, at the same time you're nimble and quick to respond to the market in a way that keeps your institution relevant? These are things that are facing campus leadership every day. And then last but certainly by no means least is advancing technology. And I think all of us have been in environments where we know that technology can be a tool to help facilitate the things that we need to get done on campus more quickly and more accurately than we could have thought, imaginable 30 years ago when I first started in higher ed. But the other piece of it is that it's also incredibly expensive to maintain and to keep up with, and it can be really challenging to implement on our campuses and implement in a way that we're getting the full benefit of that technology. And so all of these things combined can create some pretty daunting challenges for us as we're managing institutions moving forward. So before we go on, I just want to check in with Danielle and see if we had any questions or comments about this first half.
Yeah, so I did see a question come in about the student swirl that you mentioned. So can you provide an example of what that looks like and how that really plays out in real life?
You bet. So I think some of the classic examples would be students who, from a traditional population perspective, might start at your institution full-time, traditionally as a freshman, moving forward with what they want to achieve, and then some circumstance at home or in their personal lives requires them to return back to that environment. So you might see someone who starts at a 4-year institution, returns to a 2-year that's much more local, and then goes back to the 4-year to finish up their degree at some point. Or students who in the summertime are enrolling in institutions that aren't yours to either pick up units so they can continue on their path at a pace that will have them graduate in a reasonable amount of time. But during that time, they're somebody else's student. They're not yours, and you're having to think about transfer credit and how does that fit into the degree program, and how do you can you assure students that what they're doing will actually be applicable? Those are just 2 examples.
Great, thank you. Another question came in about the regulatory environment. How much change or disruption could the regulatory environment really experience?
A
loaded question.
Yeah, really. You know, there are pundits at this point that say that we can expect, given the patterns of what we're seeing from the Trump administration, for it to be less regulatory than I think what many of us were expecting within another 4 years of, you know, kind of an extension of where the Obama administration was taking us. But what does that mean for us in terms of a day-to-day operation? I don't know. You know, some of the consequences of what we saw with increased regulation and pressure for accountability were a number of for-profit institutions that, quite frankly, had a substantial amount of the market share, particularly in the post-traditional population. As they've collapsed, much of that opportunity has moved towards private nonprofits who offer online education. Does that mean that there's a rise in those for-profit institutions again that that takes back that market share? I don't know. I just wouldn't even dare to say at this moment, but I can promise that it's going to be an interesting time.
Great, thank you.
All right, so now that I've, you know, brightened your day with all of that fun stuff around the pressures that we face in the institutions, I want to talk a little bit about some of the opportunities or ways to really think about growth and sustainability despite all of this, or actually as a result of all of this. So I think for any of us who have worked on a college campus, you know, when we've faced challenges and times on our campus, we've seen one or more of these strategies kind of land on our plates. And I can certainly tell you in my time at being at a couple of different institutional types, I've seen cycles of this happen more than once. And so there's a lot of directions that institutions can go. There's a few here, though, that I would really encourage us to think about as being real opportunities to ground ourselves in ways to focus on growth and on the future for our institutions. And first and foremost for me is to go back to basics, right? To think about what is our institutional mission. I think more than anything, that's where institutions really can differentiate themselves, is in that core mission and history, and thinking about what are the competencies of our institution? What do our faculty bring? What does our history, what do our alumni bring to the table, because they're ours. Nobody else is going to have that same kind of flavor or culture that we do. And so how do we leverage that in a way to really allow growth to happen for our institutions? And one of the best ways to do that, I think, is through the development of your program portfolio mix and how you are represented to the market in terms of the kinds of programs that you offer. And this is really the chance to marry your faculty expertise and interest with market opportunity. And think about the work that your faculty do and how it might be aligned with employment opportunities. And think in those verticals. How can we take you know, a faculty member in marketing who is particularly interested in social media, for example, and align a program opportunity, a concentration or a specialization in particular that might directly go to a vertical for the opportunities that exist in the job market. Because whether we want to embrace it or not, the vast majority of our students show up at our doorstep with a vocational aspiration in mind. They want career advancement, they want career change, and this is particularly true in the adult space. Now, what's fascinating about this, though, is when you talk with them afterwards, when they're alumni and through our programs and through the experience at our institutions, they talk about the transformation. They talk about the experience, the project, the faculty member that changed their thinking or their view of the world. But that's really tough to get people to think about coming in the front door. So if you can speak to those vertical and opportunities that relate to those employment opportunities while focusing on your core competency, there's real opportunity. And, you know, I mentioned the concentration and specialization. This is something that that we at Helix hold firmly to, and you all may have seen a couple of articles that we've put out recently around this same idea, but you want to think about your program offerings as a way to maximize your opportunities, but also understand that scale is imperative. So the example that we use for this is to create core experiences within your degree program. So the MBA is just a classic natural for this. Nice, expected core of course requirements that really touch on all of the major disciplines within business, right? It's intended to be almost a survey of that far-reaching space in business and management. But then in taking that core and adding concentrations or specializations that go back to those alignments of specific job opportunities, what you're doing is running the vast majority of your graduate business students through that core. You've got nice solid section sizes, but then you really explode your opportunities by looking at operations, finance, financial planning, human resources, benefits and compensation, all of those things aligning as concentrations within that, which then really give you lots of reach, because as students are coming to your websites predominantly to figure out what their next opportunity is for education, they again are going to be thinking about words that tie to that employment opportunity, and you want to be able to speak that language, and you can do that through those concentrations. So it's a great way to not have to support full degree programs, to be very nimble with what's happening in the job market, and to create scale and nice financial margins in your section sizes, because you've got the vast majority going through a shared core of the program. And then with that, you also want to think about the regulatory complexities. It does me no good as a partner in the work that we at Helix do to say to you, you should pursue a degree program that would require you to go out and hire a new cadre of full-time faculty, that would require you to achieve a specialized accreditation, that requires you to take on additional reporting requirements based on the regulatory environment. If we couldn't really demonstrate a sufficient return on investment to justify all of those additional costs. So at the time that you're thinking about those program opportunities, if you've got something that might be, you know, a pretty significant market opportunity, but when you sit down and put pen to paper and realize that the infrastructure costs to support it are just going to outweigh any opportunity there, that's a perfect time to just say no. And that's okay, because there'll be others out there who are already prepared, have what they need to be able to pursue it, and you don't want to get in that game with them. So having those things in mind up front as you pursue the opportunity to grow through your portfolio mix will be really important. The other thing you want to do is you know, those first things, again, going back to the internal and external, those are really the internal pieces of things. But you want to make sure that you've got a comprehensive understanding of the external, understanding that labor market analysis, the competition, who else might be in this space, or who else might also be an up-and-comer in that space, which really requires having an ear to the ground in what's happening in your region or where you want to offer the program. You want to think about return on investment, but not only for your institution, but I think it's important for us to start communicating to students about the value of the degree for them as a return on investment. They are investing both financial resources and time resources, and need to understand that there's a reality for them at the other end of this that has true value. And I think we have some responsibility to articulate that. We also want to think about the cost of acquisition, and I think this goes back to some of the things we talked about, the regulatory considerations as well. And then think about geographic opportunities. We've all done it. We've all been in the room, and we might have a small, regionally based, fairly reputable program or brand with our programs, and someone around the table says, well, I don't understand why we just can't go national. And what it takes to get from owning your backyard to really being a national presence is significant. And so we encourage you to think about this not as a, let's try to cover all 50 states, but to think about it as a very strategic way to pull apart at what your geographic opportunities are. Where are your alum? Where does your brand currently exist? Where might you find affinity groups that will respond to your mission? Those are going to be your opportunities to expand geographically. That will happen with a much stronger return on your investment and also much more quickly. So those are some opportunities there. I know I covered a lot in this slide, so I'm just going to do a quick check-in to see if there's questions.
Yep, we've got one coming in from Illinois. Do you find that you are able to leverage your career center or alumni departments to find the best labor market analysis, or is it best to find that alone through census or Gallup data?
I believe that you use every resource at your fingertips. One of the things that I love that's been happening in career centers, probably in the last 5 to 7 years in particular, and a lot of this spearheaded by NACE, which is the National Organization for Career Educators, is this idea of really rich web-based tools for students to use as they're exploring and doing informational interviewing, as it were, using these online tools. And I think we lose sight of the fact that those same rich resources could actually be really beneficial for us in evaluating what the potential is in the labor market, specifically in the regions where we want to serve. It's really, really easy to go to the Department of Labor and get broad national statistics or even state-level statistics, but a lot of the tools available now through our career centers help us really hone in on what's going on there. And absolutely, alumni engagement is critical. It shows you pockets of where your brand's going to be known. It gives you a chance to leverage word of mouth, which is always your highest return in terms of your funnel and really driving enrollment. So you want to make sure that you're engaging them. They're also going to be great connections for corporate partnerships, places you might be able to tap into that network's going to be incredibly vital for that success. And do you find that employers value concentrations attached to other degrees as much as they value full degree programs in that same topic? I think really what they value are students who are able to articulate the outcomes of the degree program that they're in. I think it's important that we equip students with the ability to be able to speak to what they learned in those programs and then to have artifacts that demonstrate that level of learning. I think if employers can see, one, that students have some connection to that vertical, whether it's an MBA in social media or a Master's of Science in social media, I think that they're going to be most concerned about how the student articulates and any work product that he or she might have to demonstrate that, more so than the name of the degree.
Great, thanks, Cherron.
You're welcome. So the other piece that that many institutions are considering at this point is the idea of collaborating with an external partner. but that's a pretty scary prospect, right? We know our institutions best. We understand the culture. We understand the mission and values. And it's really challenging sometimes to think about how we can bring in a partner that will share and embrace those same things and then represent them the same way that we might in the work that we're doing. But I think these challenging times and all of the pressures against our institutions, again, are asking for that focus, going back to our mission and back to our core competencies, and to really be comfortable acknowledging that there are things that we do incredibly well on our campuses, but there are just some things that are served better by a scale that we would never achieve. And one of those things might be something like we're exploring being in the adult market. We know that adult students tend to do their search online. They're typically going to send out between 7 and 10 inquiries to various different institutions. And more often than not, the institution that's successful with that enrollment is the one that reached that student first. So what does that mean? A call center that can respond very quickly and very meaningfully to students in those inquiries. Well, if I'm running a fairly small program, trying to staff that call center, the technology that it requires to manage that well, to track those engagements, to know what the performance of my staff is, I mean, those are pretty significant things to invest in and to undertake. So those are some of the things that we might allow ourselves to start exploring and thinking about. How do we collaborate with an external partner? EduVentures recently did a study and really looked at that, you know, among the numerous colleges and universities that are out there, particularly those in online education, many of them were outsourcing some component of service around that operation beyond the use of the learning management system. And so it's becoming a reality for many of our institutions as we think about doing that. But so what does that mean, right? How do we get there? How do we get to a point where bringing in a collaborative partner is actually something that that the campus as a whole can embrace and understand and feel like they have a sense of that engagement and some ownership in that versus being really reluctant and putting up roadblocks to success in that relationship. And I think that there's some really key steps that need to be taken for that to happen successfully. I think first and foremost within the institution, before the partner's even engaged, the institution needs to find the need. And that's really that question of what is it that we do really well and what is it that we could spend our resources on better or spend our energy on more wisely and could consider being outsourced. But that's a conversation that needs to happen. And then when you get to the point that you kind of know what that need is, then think about what the intended outcomes or goals are of that relationship. What do you really want to achieve? And what's the intention? You know, why would you go online? What would your expectations be if you began to open your doors to adult students? What does that look like? And then establish the criteria, and that criteria should be not only your expectations in what you would want from your partner, but most definitely what the criteria would be or should be for that relationship. What are those, what does service look like? What does the exchange of information between your campus and your partnership look like? What's the turnaround time for everything from transfer credit to financial aid, all of those things, and don't be afraid to really be concrete in what your expectations are around that in looking for a partner that can really meet those expectations. And then conduct due diligence and be deliberative, but I would say at the same time, speed is of the essence, right? So you want to make sure that you are really asking the right questions, that you are going through a process of discovery, not only to understand how your partner's going to work in this, but how you're going to engage with your partner. But you also want to make sure that that you're doing it with some degree of speed, because time is of the essence for everyone at this point. And then at some point, you've got to be willing to take the leap. You're not going to have 100% of the answers. You're not going to have concrete assurances about every aspect of this. and you've just got to figure out that the pros definitely outweigh the cons and take the leap in this, but that most certainly means that you want to continue the conversation. Make sure that your partner is going to engage the constituencies on campus and is going to keep you informed on a regular and planned basis, that you have opportunities internally with your organization to be able to reconnect, and to rethink, are we reaching the outcomes that we intended? Has something in the landscape shifted again? Do we need to readjust those outcomes? And bring your partner to the table for those conversations as you have them. But this is really some important considerations as you might explore bringing in an outside partner. Any questions, comments about that?
I did see one question come in about just managing internal pushback to working with a partner. How do you kind of manage that interaction?
Well, I'm a firm believer, and we'll talk about this a little bit in the next set of slides, but I'm a firm believer in creating an environment of trust within the internal constituencies, and that really requires a degree of transparency that I think all of us could strive to be better at. And I'll give you a classic example of this. There are institutions that I've worked with over the years that don't have meaningful conversations about the financial realities of their institution, both in terms of the cost of doing business, but also in terms of the opportunities that might exist by exploring some things or taking some risk. And I think without creating a context or a framework about why you'd even go into a partnership in the first place, really creates an environment that's going to welcome that pushback. And that's why that discussion about the need, why would we even have to go down this path in the first place, is so critical. I think you're always going to have people who, for their own agenda, are recalcitrant about this stuff. And there are ways to manage around them, frankly. But it's important to, as much as possible, to be truthful, to be transparent, and to be open about the realities of your institution and why this is the best option for what you want to accomplish.
And the next question, it seems like kind of gets at where the needs of the organization and the mission of the organization really overlap, and does one kind of take precedent over the other?
Well, I think ultimately the mission is your talisman, right? It's that touchstone that tells you what your institution should be about, what its core learning objectives should be, what it represents within the community. And I can't imagine if your mission at this stage is so developed in such a way that it's so constrictive to not be responsive to what's happening in the marketplace, it may be time to explore, does that mission need to grow, or is it time for it to evolve? And that's certainly a whole nother set of conversation. But I think that it's very easy to align the fact that it's imperative to make decisions for the sustainability of the institution, to be able to keep it viable and healthy, to continue to have that outreach of your mission, whatever that might be, whether it's social justice or serving populations that are going to be educating tomorrow's youth, whatever that mission might be. That sustainability piece has always got to be, kind of written between the lines, because if you can't keep your doors open, then that's certainly not going to be reflective of your mission either.
Great, thank you.
So I alluded to this in answering the earlier question a little bit, but this idea of building trust and managing change, and certainly partnership is just one aspect of this. And that's the idea of the organizational culture, right? Really understanding what's happening within that organization, what those norms are, what those traditions are, and how do you both respect them and keep an eye towards the future. And really, this is a great quote by Shine, who's kind of the godfather of culture research. You don't want to have those unanticipated and undesirable consequences, right? We want to achieve that idea that our institutions have longevity and that we can continue to serve and stretch. And so it really requires us to manage change carefully and to engage all of our areas of our campuses in a way that allows them to feel a part of things. And I think that really happens by nurturing and developing trust. And we'll talk a little bit about some components of how to do that in just a minute. That transparency, we talked about that just a moment ago, but that idea of really being honest about why we're in the situation we're in, what the circumstances were, both within our control and without, and what our options are to be able to move through this, and to engage a conversation about what those options might look like is very important. And you can only do that by bringing people together. And I know that's a little bit contradictory to what I was talking about with the speed condition, but it needs to be done deliberatively and intentionally, but we can't spin in the conversation, right? Ultimately, some decisions have to be made, and that needs to be part of the transparency of the conversation. And sometimes, as challenging as it is, we have to agree to disagree. I once had a CFO that I worked with very closely when I was in enrollment management who said to me, Cherron, all this conversation changes when enrollment is growing. And ultimately, I think for those of you that are in leadership around enrollment and administration, you understand that, that the minute you can kind of shift that trend and begin to see enrollment growth and the resulting resources that come from that, some of those negative folks and the folks that are going to drag their feet a little bit will begin to quiet down when they see that success, and it gives them some freedom to focus their attention elsewhere. So developing trust is not an easy thing. It is ongoing and developing, and it needs to be done every day, in every exchange, in every conversation. But one of the critical things is that we need to be able to demonstrate competence within our roles. And we need to really show that we're backing up the things that we're saying with facts, with research, with information that is beyond just our gut, and that really can speak to what the opportunities are and why we're making the decisions that we're making. We also need to all remind one another and ourselves sometimes that there's an assumption of goodwill in our actions underneath all of that. We want to be really clear on agendas and intentions, and we want to question others when they aren't so clear. It's important, I think, to kind of call out those elephants in the room. But we also need to be driven by more than the business model. I don't think there's anything more disastrous than to walk in with just the financial plan and talk about revenue streams when there is so much more to the institution and what it represents. So, you know, conversations around quality and rigor are valuable and vital, and you want to assure your faculty in particular, if you're thinking about moving in this online direction or expanding geographically something outside of your immediate borders, that those things that they hold so dear are not going to be watered down or diluted as things move forward. Also think about opportunities for what I call small ball. What are the incremental wins? What are some things that can happen within the organization that don't take huge resource, don't take huge time, but are actually kind of pain points for folks who might be trying to get something accomplished? And as those small ball wins begin to accumulate, you're going to build trust in those various constituencies. If you hear something from, you know, your students that they're unhappy with, the vending machines aren't filled consistently, and you make that phone call and get those fixed, students are going to know, one, that you listened, and two, that you responded. And I think sometimes we lose sight of the opportunities for those small wins and how valuable they can be in really developing trust, and those are truly missed opportunities. Again, bring people together and find that common ground and common language. Often what happens in these conversations around change is that, you'll get multiple people in the room, all who I think want the same end, but describe the journey along the way very, very differently, and it gets lost in that translation. So take time to really think about, where do we all want to be? Do we all understand? Is there a shared vocabulary around this? And then check in on that vocabulary as we're moving forward to make sure that that something doesn't get lost along the way. And then break down silos, and I think that's probably one of the most important pieces that we need to do on our campuses. Our work, I think, for the most part, tends to be fairly isolating. If you're in enrollment, that's what you do. You enroll. Or if you're a faculty member, you're focused on the curriculum, you're focused on assessment, you're focused on all those components, and oftentimes those two worlds don't meet up. We'll use this as an opportunity to bring those constituents together and to work together. And probably of all the things that I've shared with you today, this is one of the ones I think that for me in my career has been most profound. I spent probably the first 17 or 18 years of my career working primarily on the administrative side of things, student affairs and enrollment, all of that work. And then about 10 years ago was invited to kind of cross the line, as it were, to become an academic dean and serve in academic leadership. And I know that that's fairly unheard of, and I consider myself very lucky to have had that opportunity. But in doing that, I also was able to develop an appreciation for the academy and for faculty and faculty work in a way that I don't think I had ever had exposure to when I had been in these predominantly administrative roles. And that shifted my view of the institution and the opportunities within the institution for us to really make some progress and move forward together. So I would say, one, if you ever get the chance to kind of cross that line or work on a team that's cross-functional like that, take it in a heartbeat. And I would say, two, whenever you can facilitate that to happen, the benefits of it are tremendous. So I encourage you to definitely take advantage of any moment that you can to bring cross-functional teams together. Questions or comments about any of that?
So I've got a couple that I'm actually going to combine into one. So I had a question about recommendations on how to bring the internal team together and on the same page to grow enrollment. And then there was another question about just asking for strategies for bringing people together. So I think if you can flesh out sometimes how that looks or what those strategies are.
Sure. I think one of the important things is just to create an environment where those groups can come together. So if you're sitting in an enrollment position and not feeling particularly connected to academics, I would say reach out one-on-one first. Find someone in a key position, and not necessarily a leadership position, but think about who is influential on your campus in a particular role, and take them out to coffee, right? Start there, and really think about and talk with them about, here are the challenges that I see for our institution. How do you see that from your role day to day, and how can we come up with some common ground? Now let's think about how do we bring a group of folks together, and you really want to find those influencers. Who are the people on your campus, whether by title or not, could really bring folks together for a conversation? And I would open it as that, just from a strategic perspective, and really think about what's the number one thing facing our institution today. Okay, if it's enrollment, then let's come together and talk about, first and foremost, what's the reality of enrollment? And I think that's a piece that we often miss, right? So what are some of those statistics around what the enrollment landscape looks like? What's the opportunity? What does our competitor set look like? And so you've got that framework. And then begin to tease out solutions, again, with that cross-functional. I would say, anytime you could have a workshop opportunity, or to do it through, like a task force or or something like that, that you can bring those teams together, kind of put them in a room, buy them lunch for a few hours, and let them begin to throw some things on the wall, and you'll see and tease out some opportunities for real accomplishment and direction. Some things are going to be, again, and get folks to think about short-term versus long-term. And those short-term things, go about fixing them as quickly as possible or making those changes. And the long-term things, then think about, what does that need to look like organizationally? Does that mean that we change maybe some structure where we have a unit that's cross-functional? Or can we continue to do this in this ad hoc manner? A lot of it's going to depend on the direction that you go in. I actually, in my last role, was very lucky in that folks were kind of at a loss at my institution about what to do with serving the undergraduate population. We'd been doing it for a long time, but it had significant declines in enrollment year over year. And it was thought by the senior leadership of the institution, well, let's create a school, as it were, that would be cross-functional. So we had liberal arts faculty, we had business faculty, we had administrators, we had professional advisors, all in this one group. And we were kind of, tossed into an office suite and said, okay, try to make something of this. And it was a great opportunity, I think, for all of us to understand both the lens that each of us came to this challenge with, but to also come up with some solutions. And by the time it was all said and done in that space and in that organizational structure that was supported by the institution, we were able to accomplish significant growth and improve the experience for students. But I've also seen those same things happen with some ad hoc groups too, so it really depends on what you're going to jump into.
Great, thanks, Cherron.
You're welcome. So as we wrap up, we have about 10 minutes left in case there's more questions or more thoughts you all want to send to Danielle. I just would share with you that there's a lot going on. If you worked in higher ed for more than 30 minutes at this point, you know that things are changing at a rate and a pace that I don't think any of us expected to have happen. But I think the real exciting thing is that every challenge that's in front of us actually can create a great opportunity. And, as trite as that may seem, it really is the truth. We have an opportunity right now to think about how do we stay true to the most important aspects of our institutions while responding to all of this change and thinking about what the future of education might look like and where we can take our organizations. But I think what's really important, though, is to acknowledge that we don't have a lot of time to make those decisions. I don't think rarely a week goes by anymore that you don't pick up the Chronicle of Higher Ed or an Inside Higher Ed email that you don't see of another institution that is closing or suspending its services. And every time that happens, I think a little part of me just mourns, because that's a loss to what's going on in higher ed. And so I encourage all of you to think about today's the day. Today's the easiest day that you'll have in determining what could happen for your institution for tomorrow. And so I welcome to see you all or to hear from you all. If you would like to reach out to me, please feel free. My contact information is here, and as Danielle said, she'll be sending out this information to everyone. Please feel free to give me a call or send me an email, and I welcome the continued conversation.
Thank you so much, Cherron. And it looks like we have just one outstanding question, and it looks like they're looking for examples of small ball wins with particularly faculty and staff. Can you give an example in your experience of a small ball win with those groups of constituents?
Well, it's interesting, and so I can share some specific examples, but I'm sure every campus is going to be a little bit different. When I first stepped into the role as dean, I had 7 full-time faculty that were in the unit with me, and we probably had about 200 adjunct faculty members who were teaching classes for us, but not particularly connected to or engaged with the environment. All the things that we're trying to do in our undergraduate programs unit. So one of the discussions that I had had with a couple of the adjuncts was that they just felt like they weren't getting any information about what was going on. And we had a long-standing practice of having a monthly department meeting where enrollment information was shared, updates about the institution. We'd have some conversations around curriculum or issues of teaching and learning. But it was happening right smack in the middle of the business day. And in a classroom in our San Francisco building. And for most of our adjuncts who were working professionals and who were all over the state of California predominantly, that wasn't workable. So one of the first things I did was set up a webinar much like this. And this is how we started doing our monthly staff meetings. And every single adjunct that was active with us was invited to those meetings. And then we always followed up with the slide deck and with minutes from the meeting for them to be engaged. And that was the easiest fix in the world. Kept the same time, kept the same classroom, kept the same material, just created a space using technology to welcome the rest of the group in. And what that meant for their affinity and their engagement and their understanding of kind of their role within the bigger department was huge. And so then when it came time for me to do really big projects like assessment, they actually knew what was going on. So when I had a call for volunteers to be on some evaluation teams, I had more volunteers than I knew what to do with because they were engaged in a part of the environment. So sometimes it can be as simple as that. Sometimes it's something as easy as bringing a refrigerator into the office so people can store drinks right there and not have to go to the lounge. I mean, simple kinds of things. It just depends on your environment. But those are the things we often miss in the day-to-day.
Great, thank you so much. That looks like all the questions that I have. So I just wanted to go ahead and wrap up by thanking everyone for attending Growing in Today's Higher Ed Landscape with Dr. Cherron Hoppes. Again, we'll be sending the materials from this webinar, so the PowerPoint presentation and a link to the video recording to all participants afterward. So stay on the lookout for future webinars in our Enrollment Growth University series. And if you have not already downloaded our Enrollment Growth Playbook, I wanted to go ahead and encourage you to, again, to head to our website, helixeducation.com, and download your free copy today. So with that, that concludes our webinar. Thank you so much, Cherron, for the enlightening conversation today.
My pleasure, and thank you again for everyone's time today.
All right, bye-bye.